The current protests happening all across our country that were set off by George Floyd's extrajudicial police murder are, as the title of these special lectures suggests, a consequence of a dream deferred. But which dream? Some say real police reform. I say reparations. If reparations had been given to black Americans in 1865 or even 1965, then George Floyd would probably still be alive today, because he probably wouldn't have had any need to use an alleged counterfeit $20 bill. But what's the moral basis for reparations to black Americans? Two philosophers have distinguished themselves by presenting rigorous arguments for the morality of black American reparations. The first comes from Bernard Boxall, who in 1972 published a paper called The Morality of Reparations, and the argument goes something like this. First, all slaves had a moral right to the products of their labor, such as wealth acquired from their inventions and field work. This follows from John Locke's theory of individual property rights. Second, all slave owners stole these products and passed them on to their descendants. This is a matter of historical fact. Third, any stolen products that are passed on to descendants should be returned to the rightful owners, insofar as is possible. This is Boxall's reparations principle. Fourth, the rightful owners of the products of slave labor are slave descendants. Since people are already inheriting liabilities, why shouldn't they be allowed to inherit assets? Fifth, it's possible to return products of slave labor. We know this is possible. For example, Georgetown University has owned up to benefiting financially from selling 272 slaves in 1838 and has set up a reparations fund to benefit the living descendants of those slaves. Thus, the products of slave labor should be returned to slave descendants. That's one way to defend the morality of black reparations. However, there's some limitations. For one, it only justifies slavery reparations and not any of the reparations eligible injustices against blacks that occurred after slavery, like re-enslavement of blacks using a loophole in the 13th Amendment and vagrancy laws, lynchings, unfair inequalities created from Jim Crow laws, racial discrimination in mortgage lending, and so forth. The argument also doesn't apply to groups. This brings us to the next argument, which is from Howard McGarry's 1999 book, Race and Social Justice. His argument goes like this. First, groups that received, on the whole, unfair advantages from some institution should return reparative advantages to groups that received, on the whole, unfair disadvantages from that institution. This is McGarry's reparations principle. Second, the group white Americans have received, on the whole, unfair advantages from the institutions of American chattel slavery, Jim Crow laws, anti-black racist school zoning and white flight, anti-black racial discrimination in mortgage lending, and so forth. And the group black Americans have been, on the whole, unfairly disadvantaged by these institutions. These are social facts. Third, some reparative advantages in this case are preferential treatment in education and employment, such as reparative Department of Education funding for Title I public schools turned into Title I public schools from white flight from court-ordered racial desegregation busing in the 1970s, like the middle school I went to. Thus, white Americans should return at least preferential treatment in education and employment. This is a sample of some of the moral justifications for black American reparations from philosophers. Hopefully, they'll help us to expand our imaginations about which dream was deferred.